Hello, and thank you all for joining us again here today on Hastings County for another TTRPG talk. This video series takes a look at tabletop role-playing games related materials, makes suggestions for your own games, and takes a look at some of my own materials. There won't be a little introductory thing on the beginning of this video, because, as you can probably hear, my voice is still recovering. So we're going to make this sort of a short, simple, sweet, largely unedited video. Previously, I had created a couple of videos where I was taking a look at my own creative process. If I remember correctly, I think the series was entitled like One Way to Create a TTRPG. And in that, I kind of went through the, I kind of explained some ways that I kind of come up with ideas for games. And then also take a look at specifically the creative process that I went through when creating Banner Ships of the 10,000 Stars. Today is going to be a bit different. Again, I am going to be talking about a game that's kind of in process and talking about like where this all came from and stuff. But the basic idea behind this video is actually in part inspired by a Substack sort of newsletter that recently came out, written by Cesar Capalque, which you can actually see right now on screen. And I'll include a link to this down below. But basically, this, just to kind of summarize it a bit, this is essentially talking a lot about how when you're creating, basically you have two different kind of versions of creation. We have what Cesar kind of talks about as being inspired creativity, which is where a lot of my games have generally come from, where basically like I have an idea, it pops into my head almost fully formed, and it just kind of comes into being to a certain extent. And that is actually how Cesar describes his own creation process, especially when it comes to his game Kismet, and then also in a very similar fashion, the origins of his most recent game, which is Midnight Melodies, in which you play a jazz pianist who the Grim Reaper came to collect you, but for some reason couldn't. So instead, you're operating essentially as one of his agents. And the basic idea of this post is kind of describing basically what we have here. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this quote because I think it very, very, very well summarizes this. Again, these things specifically referring to inspiration don't happen often, but when they do, you've got to be ready. In a way, I believe that a diligent creativity nurtures inspired creativity. When a strike of inspiration happens, your creative muscles are prepared for what is about to happen. And then it goes on, you've been through this, you know the steps, you know what needs to get done. You can create the outline in minutes, and you know how the pieces should fall. So in many ways, this is kind of basically encouraging, even if you are a creator and you're not really feeling it right now, you should still go through the motions anyway, in part because you're practicing your craft, essentially, right? I've of course been through this because, for throughout a lot of my school career, I was a musician, I was a saxophonist. There were many days where, you're just not really feeling it. You might not want to play today, but you do it anyway. Why? Because you know that if you don't practice now, that when you really are feeling it later, or you know that you got to get together, you got to get through that work now, so that later you're ready when you really are feeling it and you need to perform, right? Obviously, you shouldn't be like creating in misery, right? But you might not necessarily be super clicking with what's going on. You're enjoying what you're doing, of course, and the different elements that you're using are incredibly useful. These are tools that you use very frequently when you're making games, but you're still making it anyway, because then when the muse does strike, you're prepared to potentially be able to bang out that game really quick, especially for those of us where inspiration can sometimes be fleeting, where the idea hits you, and if you're not prepared to be able to crank that out, that idea might leave you before you've finished, and then you end up with a half-finished, half-baked game that just doesn't feel very good, even if you had a great idea at the beginning. So, and again, of course, Caesar does explicitly come out here and say, I'm not advocating for insomnia as a creative process. And I can definitely agree with that. But, you know, if you've practiced, if you've practiced that diligent creativity, when the inspiration does strike, you don't have to resort to insomnia necessarily to be able to get that idea into at least a testable state where you can kind of tune and do some fine crafting of it as you go along. And in many ways, that has kind of happened with the game that I'm kind of working on right now. The working title for it is The Political Animal. And this is in some ways another one of those examples of diligent creativity. Um, in some ways, it was inspired because it does have an inspiration, and that is this game right here. This is a game that was created by Karl Larsson. Here, I'll go ahead and bring up the Drive-Through RPG video page for it. And this is called Republic. And it is basically an adaptation of the Gumshoe engine for essentially political operatives, politics and intrigue. So in many ways, this is kind of like how if you took the Gumshoe engine and you maybe built it out with the intention of running the types of games that you might get with like Court of Blades or something like that. In that, basically, this is creating stories about politics and political operatives and how they operate. Now, for those of you who might have seen some posts that I put up on social media, those of you who follow me on social media, you might know that my day job essentially it's not politics, but it's political adjacent. Because this just seemed like a good fit for something it's something I already know a lot about. I also went to school. Some of my schooling was also in politics and in history, which of course also is greatly shaped by social politics, or at least social movements and things like that. So politics takes up a lot of my mental space, my mental energy, essentially, I guess you could say. So this game, essentially, I was trying to create. It's inspired by, Republic, as I mentioned, but in many ways, I'm going in a very different direction. So in order to do that, basically, I'm taking a completely different engine. The Gumshoe engine of course, was originally created with the idea of creating, mystery stories and stuff like that, explorations, investigation, right? Um, and I decided to take it in a different way, and I'm using the Breathless engine, at least at the moment. So, of course, with a lot of Breathless engine games, I decided to create 5 approaches. Again, each of these is going to have a dice value assigned to them, depending upon how skilled your character is at doing certain things. And of course, a lot of politics is rhetoric, right? A lot of politics is talking, convincing people of things, whether those people are voters or those people are other politicians or interest groups, or maybe if you're a leader of an interest group and you're trying to convince a politician. Either way, there's a lot of speaking, talking, rhetoric involved in all of this. And of course, one of the more famous people who've written about rhetoric is Aristotle. And Aristotle, in many ways, kind of separated the idea of rhetoric, and other writers before him also did the same thing. And since then, have separated the ideas of rhetoric into 3 different basic categories. And those are the 3 of the 5 approaches that we have here. So here we have logos, which is basically attempting to use logic. In this case, essentially, you're making a logical argument. But the idea is that here, I'm kind of taking that and I'm stretching them a bit further. Instead of just, with the idea of, oh, you're using logic to try to convince another person, right? I'm also, or well-reasoned arguments, essentially. I also kind of stretched a bit more to be you using logic yourself, basically trying to analyze a situation, right? Or also you could use your own logic to try to resist a person who is attempting to use one of the two other rhetorical argument styles to convince you of something, right? So essentially, this could also act each of these three rhetorical approaches could also act as a defense, essentially. So yeah, as I mentioned, the first one is logos, and that is essentially attempting to use logic to solve a problem, or to convince someone of to kind of follow your own train of thought. The second one is pathos. Pathos is an appeal to emotion. This could be utilizing emotion, basically to appeal to a person's sympathies, or try to instill a feeling of anger or happiness or whatever. You're attempting to appeal to an emotion. You're attempting to intimidate someone, to motivate a person to do something by appealing to their emotions, right? This also could be used to self-motivate. The third one was ethos. Now, ethos is a bit harder to describe, but basically the way that Aristotle essentially approached this idea is that you're appealing to the habits and the morals of a person. And in this case, I kind of stretched it out a bit further to include also like the cultural practices, your shared cultural practices between the person who is appealing and the person who is receiving the rhetoric. So in this case, you might be appealing to the status quo, or whether that is legal or social. Maybe you're using your ethos to try to avoid creating a social faux pas, or to make yourself appear above, the various forms of social scandal that might be occurring in politics. Or you're appealing to, this could be useful for like appeals to nationalism, or appeals to, tried and true traditions of your culture or country or whatever. So those are the three sort of rhetorics that would appear in this game. You have logos, pathos, and ethos. To kind of round it out, I also included again, using Greek terminology that was very commonly used by Aristotle, we have techne and dynamis. So techne is applying technical or specialized knowledge to a particular situation. In Aristotle kind of used this term to refer to skill or technique, right? That's where the word technique actually comes from, is the Greek techne, or technological, right? But here basically we're utilizing this to basically describe if your character is particularly skilled at utilizing certain specialized skills like advanced science, mathematics. So if you're particularly skilled at engineering, or or you're good at, for certain forms of statistics, you're specialized in certain types of arts, all of these would apply under techne. Dynamis is again dynamic, right? We're motion. This is focused on applying your own physical finesse or physical strength, personal strength, to a situation. This could be trying to outrun somebody, lockpicking, fighting, maintaining your balance, right? These are all physical dynamic things, as opposed to techne, which is applying to specialized knowledge that, of course, does not necessarily require direct physical application. So again, the basic idea is that those 5 approaches are specifically describing your character themselves and their own physical abilities, right? Or rhetorical abilities, or, of course, with techne, it's mostly mental abilities, right? However, of course, whenever we're dealing with politics, of course, is political activity in general is, of course, a social thing. It's not something you do by yourself. You literally can't do politics by yourself. Everything social is, to a certain extent, political. But, of course, that also means that everything political is social. So because of that, one thing that I wanted to utilize, this is the main reason why I actually wanted to utilize the breathless system for this game, is that then we can utilize the way that items are typically described in breathless games to describe not only actual physical things that you might have, like resources, but also to describe ideas or people or factions that you might have, favors or other things that you might be able to utilize through play. So here I have just listed in my rough draft. I have just listed some just basic ideas. So for example, you might have an advisor who provides specialized skills that might be useful for your player. So again, let's say your character is not that good at statistics. Well, here we have an advisor who is a master at statistics and polling and all the various different things that you might need in order to figure out where public opinion generally lies on a particular issue. You might have allies who, of course, are potentially fellow political actors who might owe you a favor, or you might frequently align with one another. Maybe you caucus together, right? Or you have come to rely on one another. Maybe you're a mentor for that person, or that person is a mentor to you. You generally rely on each other to help each other out. So sometimes they might be calling on you for favors, right? But you can also potentially utilize them as for favors as well. Factions, of course, would be, again, maybe political parties, but also could be things like groups of lobbyists or think tanks or interest groups that you might have bought off, or you might have earned favors for them. Basically, you've acted on their behalf in the past, so now they owe you a favor and will act on your behalf in the future. Again, I've mentioned, ideas could be, an idea for these could be resources. So in this particular case, when it comes to resources, I'm thinking of money, manpower, people power, right? Or popular opinion. So again, resources for when we're talking about, we could talk about volunteers who you could utilize to potentially get something done, like doing door-to-door knocking or whatever. Money, of course, can buy things, right? Popular opinion, maybe you just have garnered a lot of popular opinion because you have been advocating for populist ideas, and because of that, you have a lot of political clout, a lot of popular clout behind you. So you could potentially utilize that to convince other people that what you're saying is generally the popular will, right? Finally, another thing could be talking points. These are useful facts that could reinforce your argument or undermine your opponent, that might not necessarily specifically relate to what the argument is about, but are outside things that you could convince them to change their mind anyway. So like, for example, if you're trying to pass legislation that might help, let's say, homeless people, right? Obviously, pointing out the sheer number of homeless people, that obviously could be a good talking point. Or pointing out specific instances, studies in the past where people have tried to do similar things to what you're trying to pass might help convince other people that what you're trying to do is a good idea. Of course, many of us know, because of watching politics, especially recently because of social media, facts are rather loose. They could be popular misconceptions or misbeliefs, widely held believed lies, that are just conveniently can be used to boost your item, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Who knows? These could be very carefully cultivated misconceptions or oversimplifications that you yourself as a character have kind of infiltrated into the public zeitgeist. Or they could be stereotypes that you're appealing to, whether, again, positive or negative. Finally, another thing is that these talking points could literally just be blackmail. They could be things that you're not necessarily opening to the public, but you're saying basically to this other political actor, look, if you don't support me, I'm going to let them know about your mistress. Or I'm going to let them know about that one time that you said these absolutely horrible things. The initial game essentially that I was writing was essentially trying to appeal to people who might be interested in like Gilded Age American politics, where again there was a lot of money involved and a lot of bribery and nasty big business politics and all kinds of stuff like that. Or again, to kind of appealing to modern politics, where there's a lot of nasty stuff potentially going on, where even people who are attempt to try to hold themselves above all of that, um, basically this could be appealing to the type of player who wants to play a Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where you're fighting against the corruption and the pork barrel spending and all that stuff. Or it could be appeal to the people who want to get involved in that stuff, but maybe for positive reasons, or people who want to get involved in that stuff for personal gain. There could be three different ways that you play that. However, um, inspiration has kind of struck a little bit with this game, and that is because I was collecting a whole bunch of quotes that might be useful for, like, the openings of chapters or the beginning of the game, starting with like this one here with Dwight D. Eisenhower, where he's trying to express in a Lincoln address while he was president about how, you know, politics should be the part-time profession of every citizen who has any sort of interest on protecting rights or making sure that the nation continues to be basically successful as both a political and an economic endeavor. But then also another thing that popped up was this quote from Neil Gaiman. Now it's quite long, I'm not going to read it out, but just to kind of paraphrase it. Essentially, he's suggesting that, it might be a good experiment just to see how a country, government for a country might kind of shake out if essentially you did, instead of voting for people, you do governance by, essentially you do governments by lot, by which basically it's essentially the same sort of thing as a jury duty system, where everybody's name is in a hat, and every 5 years we pull out a certain number of people, and those are the people who are going to be doing X job, right? Like, and you do it for those 5 years, and then you're done for life, basically. And again, unless you have a really good reason why you can't do it, like maybe you're deployed military, right? Or you hold a critical job that kind of prevents you from being able to participate in political system. Like maybe you are actually actively like a, let's say, a bureaucrat, where you're actually doing the administrative and logistical work of government. Therefore, you can't really get pulled out to do like the actual work, the actual political work of government. You'd have a conflict of interest there potentially. But normal everyday people, like, your handyman who lives down the street, or these could be people who are absolutely uninterested in government, or people who are very vested and interested in government, but obviously because this is government by law, they haven't had an opportunity to participate yet. And in many ways, this is basically kind of the base. This was actually the origins of actually democracy, where you have democracy, right? The sort of basic idea where the bulle, or the basic council that basically would govern, was essentially selected by lot from a group of people. Basically, you would have, your basic groups, and then whoever would be operating as the politicians would be randomly selected from out of those groups to represent the group as a whole. And I just thought that this might be a really interesting way to potentially play this system, where basically, and in this case, I'm thinking that this game might not necessarily utilize the breathless system, because again, we're pulling regular everyday people. They're not necessarily geared towards being trained really well in rhetoric and stuff like that, unlike your average everyday politician would be in a political system where you have elections going on all the time. So instead, maybe this might be a good system for, like, let's say my Blossom system, where essentially you build at the beginning of the game, you build an everyday person, and then the very first thing that happens is you get the phone call saying, "Hey, you've gotten pulled in the lottery. You're up for your 5 years. You have 5 days to respond to this, or you have basically 5 days to show up at the Capitol in order to start participating in political life, or 90 days or whatever." Right? And the government provides you with like an apartment that you can live at for that 5 years. And you have to kind of leave your everyday life and job behind and instead participate in political life. Or maybe you're like living in a dormitory with a whole bunch of other people who've been thrown into the similar same situation. Um, and so those are the other players. You're basically all participating in this system. Um, so yeah, that might be another way to kind of approach this, where basically I'm utilizing the Blossom system so you could literally create any type of person you want, whether they're politically motivated or not. Pull in their backgrounds and everything. Make a randomized character essentially, if you want, or make an everyday. It's basically an everyday person, right? Um, and then maybe still utilizing the items from Breathless that could potentially boost you by giving you an extra die or something when, especially since those individuals, since they're not politically trained and motivated, um, or might not have necessarily been uh, very well versed in the basics of government, you're having to rely a whole lot on technocrats and other individuals who are more specialized, to sort of advise you on what might be good things or bad things to do in government, or what levers you need to kind of push to try to get things through. So yeah, just some two basic different kind of approaches to this that I thought might be very interesting. Um, and yeah, hopefully at some point I'll figure out which way I kind of want to go with this. In fact, I might just create two different games to kind of, show the contrast of these two different systems. Again, this, as I mentioned, kind of started off as an approach at sort of diligent creation that has kind of turned into inspired creation, um, at least to a certain extent. So yeah, again, I'm going to be including links down below for the original game that kind of sparked the original idea, which is Republic, and of course also I'm going to be including links for the um, Cesar Capalque's Substack, especially in particular this specific post that they created talking about the ideas behind the sort of contrast behind diligent creativity and inspired creativity, and basically practicing those muscles and the importance behind that. So thank you all for joining again here today. Again, subscribe if you want to potentially learn more about this or all the various other things that we do. In the future, we will be talking about, remember the basic role playing that I kind of featured in our most recent video, or other systems that I've been asked to kind of take a look at, like the second edition of Rise. And yeah, hopefully we'll be taking a look at those very soon in an SRD video. Yeah, thank you all again for joining us. Have a good zone, and don't forget to keep creating.
If you would like to show your support for this channel or for the Hessens County blog, in the description down below you will find links to the channel coffee and also the itch store. Please feel free to take a look, and thank you for your support.